So today we're going to be looking at cell specialization, and cell specialization basically tells us how different cells are organized and how their structure varies depending on their function. So let's take a look at a sperm cell. So the role of a sperm cell essentially is to burrow through the female reproductive system, burrow into the egg and fertilize the female egg. And so the sperm cell is built to do this with its structure. So over here we have the tail, and what the tail does, it helps the sperm cell to actually swim through the reproductive system. The next part of the sperm cell we can identify is this bit over here where we have basically loads of mitochondria. We can label that on. It is mitochondria, and there's quite a large number of mitochondria. And the reason why that's important is the sperm cell needs lots of energy. So this provides the sperm cell with enough energy to basically swim through the system. Okay, it allows the sperm cell to move quite fast. And the next thing we can look at is the head, and inside of the head you actually have the nucleus. And of course, all of the genetic material is inside the nucleus. The reason why the nucleus needs to be in the head is because the sperm cell is going to burrow through into the egg through this way. That's why you have this pointed head as well. This allows the sperm cell to burrow through, and then the nucleus contains basically half the DNA that's going to go and fertilize the egg. And so the role of basically both of these is to basically allow it to fertilize the egg easier. Okay, so there you can see how the sperm cell is actually adapted specifically for its function. And we can also take a look at the nerve cell. And so this is my diagram of a nerve cell, so let's label this on. And so the first thing we can notice is this big end over here. And so what we'll do is we can see that this is the nucleus as usual. And the role of a nerve cell essentially is to transmit electrical signals from our nerve endings into the central nervous system, and then they can be processed by our brain. And so we can see here we've got lots of different branches over here, and the idea is if you've got all of these branches over here, they spread out into your different, for example, your fingertips, and so this means that you can basically have nerve endings everywhere and allows you to feel sensations all over your body. The same idea over here, you have again lots of branches, and so on this side we can say that these ends basically link with adjacent cells, and once again the idea is that you'll be able to transmit the electrical impulses to other cells as you need to. Then you can see this long kind of elongated part over here, so this is what we call the axon, and the role of the axon essentially is to transmit the electrical impulses. Okay, so this is quite a key one, and the idea is because this is so long, it can transmit the electrical impulses very quickly. Let's add that on. Okay, and then you can see around the axon you've got this these blue things over here. This is essentially a coating around the axon, and this is actually called a myelin sheath. And essentially, if you imagine you have electrical impulses going through your axon over here, the role of the myelin sheath is basically act as an insulator and insulate the rest of the cell from that electrical signal. Okay, so that is a nerve cell. So now let's go on and look at a muscle cell. And so for a muscle cell, we can draw a bit more simply. So once again, we have our nucleus as usual, but really the adaptation of a muscle cell, you need to link it back to the function. So what is the function of a muscle cell? Well, muscle cells are designed to contract or expand. If you imagine you have muscle cells all over your body, and you might have cardiac cells in your heart, which contract automatically. You also have skeletal muscle, which actually you use to move your bones. So those are the things that are attached to our bones, and we can therefore move our limbs using them. You also have smooth muscle that kind of lines vessels. And again, that needs to contract. So what we notice with all of these is they need to have some kind of movement. So the adaptation really for muscle cells, you have lots of these mitochondria. So we can label that one, that these are all mitochondria. And the idea is when you have lots of mitochondria that produce lots of energy, and that energy is needed to actually contract the cells. And that is actually an adaptation of muscle cells. So now let's move on. So these are all examples of animal cells and animal cell adaptations and specializations. And now we can actually take a look now at plant cells. So for plant cells, we need to look at root hair cells. So this is what a root hair cell might look like. So remember, it's a plant cell, so it would have all the features of a plant cell. So you can put the nucleus in there. You can say that this is your vacuole. And remember, that's filled with sap. But really the adaptation that we're interested in a root hair cell essentially is this long kind of extension over here. Function of a root hair cell is to essentially expand into the soil around the root to allow to absorb different things. So it can absorb lots of water, and it can absorb also ions and minerals as well. And so the adaptation of a root hair cell is it has these very long, thin hairs essentially that stretch out into the soil. And what this does is it increases the surface area, and that allows for increased absorption of the water and vitamins and ions. So the minerals and ions that we saw there. Okay, so let's keep going now. Another plant cell which we need to look at is xylem and phloem cells. And so let's look at the xylem cell first. So the role of a xylem cell essentially is to carry water from the roots to other parts of the plant. And a xylem cell essentially is made up of lots of dead cells put together like this, and it forms this thin hollow tube like this. You can imagine these are the cells, and the idea of a xylem cell doesn't have a top or a bottom. What that means is that water, essentially, and dissolved minerals can travel through the xylem cell really easily. Okay, and the reason for that is because it's hollow. And this is important because you need to actually transport the water from the roots where they're absorbed into the other parts of the cell that also need water. Okay, and the next one we're going to look at, and the last one actually, is phloem cells. So phloem cells work quite similarly to xylem cells in that they do form this kind of tube-like substance, but essentially the function of a phloem cell is a bit different because it's used to transport glucose to other parts of the plant. And so glucose is made in the plant during photosynthesis in the chloroplast, but you need to actually transport that glucose to other parts of the plant to allow for respiration to happen and keep the other parts of the plant alive. And so phloem cells are a bit different to xylem cells in that they're not made up of dead plants with no end walls. They do have these end walls between the plants, but the difference is that these are called sieve plates, and they're specially adapted to allow glucose to flow through. Remember, this is the main thing. So you're going to be transporting glucose, for example, this way, and the glucose needs to be transported through our phloem. There's a long tube into the other parts of the cell where it's needed for respiration, as we mentioned. The sieve plates allow for the glucose to be transported like that. The structure of the phloem cell is also a little bit different. It is mainly cell sap in here, so whereas the xylem cell was basically just empty hollow and allowed water to travel through, phloem cell actually is filled with cell sap, and that's where the glucose is actually stored, and then once it gets to the other parts of the cells, can be used for respiration or can be stored as starch or to make other structures. And so phloem cells and xylem cells are actually quite similar, and within a plant actually these would be arranged together. Okay, so what you'd get essentially is a combination of phloem and xylem cells together, and they're kind of arranged in these bundles. And these are the veins that you see in the leaves of a plant. They're basically formed of the xylem and phloem cells. These two tubes that one carries water and one carries glucose. Okay, so that is it for the cells that we need to look at, and let's go into a few questions to just recap. Alright, you know the drill. Feel free to pause the video to have a go at some questions, and let's go through the answers. So question 1, give one way sperm cells are adapted to their function. So sperm cells, one thing you could say is the overall shape. So the shape of the sperm cell is designed for it to be able to burrow through into the egg and therefore fertilize the egg easily. You could also say there's also mitochondria to give it lots of energy. You could also say the tail helps it to swim through the reproductive system. All of those would be valid answers. What is a myelin sheath in a nerve cell, and what is its purpose? A myelin sheath is the fatty layer around the axon of the nerve cell, and the purpose of a myelin sheath essentially is to provide an insulating layer between the electrical signal that travels through the axon and the rest of the cell. How are muscle cells adapted to their function? Muscle cells have lots of mitochondria, and because they need to move a lot, actually this is how they're adapted to the function, because the mitochondria provides lots of energy to allow them to contract. What is the role of a root hair cell? The role of a root hair cell essentially is to allow for the absorption of water and minerals and ions. Question 5, do xylem cells have cell sap? Xylem cells actually are hollow, so they don't have any cell sap in the middle of them, so that's not true. And do phloem cells have open-end walls? Phloem cells do not have open-end walls. Open-end walls are what xylem cells have to have water to flow through the xylem cell. Phloem cells, on the other hand, as we mentioned, they have these sieve plates, and the sieve plates basically allow for the glucose to travel from one cell to the other. Okay, but it's not open-ended. Like the xylem cell, you can see these are open-ended, so these are basically open cell walls. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense, and I will see you guys in the next one.